Hello, I'm Cliff Lynch. I am the director of the Coalition for Networked Information, and I'd like to welcome you to this recording of a report out session that was conducted on November 21st, 2024, reporting on a recent executive roundtable that the Coalition for Networked Information conducted, trying to gain some insight into the approaches and strategies that research institutions were taking in the procurement of generative AI systems on an institutional or other large scale. That roundtable was held on October 16th, 2024, and we did do a subsequent in-person report out the following week at the EDUCAUSE meeting in San Antonio, Texas. We wanted to do a webinar for the CNI community to report on our findings as well. Now, we produce reports from these executive roundtables, but we thought that a less formal report out with some opportunity to field questions and answers might be helpful as well for our member institutions, especially because we could do it on a slightly more timely basis than getting the report out. So we are sharing the recording, as I said, of the webinar that was conducted on November 21st, but I've decided to put a short replacement introduction on the recording, replacing some of the introductory remarks on the webinar itself. I felt that that was worth doing because the webinar was intended for the real-time webinar was intended for and attended by members of CNI institutions. So they already brought a lot of context about CNI and some of its processes and approaches to that webinar. We're releasing this recording to the broad public, and I thought a little bit more context, both on CNI and on the executive roundtables might be helpful. CNI, the Coalition for Networked Information, has been around since the 1990s. We have about 220 members. They are predominantly research institutions in the US and Canada, but they also include a number of government agencies, technology providers, publishers, and other folks who share a common interest in the use of information technology and digital content to advance research, teaching, and learning. One of the tools, one of the methods that CNI has been using for a number of years to gain insight into the thinking and the landscape of our members and their activities is a thing called an executive roundtable. Here we invite small teams from our member institutions, typically 2 or 3 people representing different administrative roles and perspectives within the institution, to join with other institutions for a sort of a semi-anonymous discussion of what they're thinking and how they are approaching a specific group of emerging issues. We found these to be extremely valuable in gaining insight into the current state of play around various issues. Certainly, we were hearing a lot of concern from our members, a lot of conflicting information from our members about some of the approaches that were being taken on procuring and implementing generative AI systems at an institutional or other pretty large scale basis, which led us to do this roundtable. Now, let me say a couple of other things about roundtables that are really important to understand. First off, these are intended to be exploratory. They are quantitative. They are not, excuse me, they are qualitative rather than quantitative in nature. They are not surveys. They are not attempts to scientifically measure where people are on things. Every roundtable has a certain idiosyncratic quality to it that is driven by the particular individuals and particular institutions that participate in the roundtable and the roles and perspectives that those participants bring. Um, Generally speaking, the folks represented in these are relatively large, relatively well-resourced um, research institutions. Uh, and moreover, I would stress these are research institutions almost exclusively in the US and Canada. And this one, I would say, skewed heavily US in particular. So all of those things are constraints on the perspectives that you will hear here. The last thing I want to say by way of introduction before moving on to the report out is that um, oftentimes when we've convened roundtables, we have found a lot of consensus about the facts, about things like what are the cost models, how well do the available product offerings or tools work or not work, things of that nature. You certainly would find in any of our roundtables a spectrum of perspectives on appropriate institutional policy in light of those facts. What are the right strategy choices that specific institutions are choosing to pursue? But the base of facts generally had a pretty good consensus around it. I would say that in this area, that consensus was weaker than any consensus that I have ever seen for an executive roundtable. It indicates that there are still a lot of pieces of contradictory information, different understandings about even definitional issues in some cases. And I think that being mindful of that is going to be very helpful and worth keeping in mind as you try and interpret the results. So, with that, let me welcome you again. Um, Please do keep your eyes open for the formal report of the roundtable, which I think you'll find to be a helpful supplement to this recording. And I take you to the recording itself. Thank you for joining us. So, with that by way of introduction, let me start by talking a little bit about what we were trying to understand. We were trying to get a handle on what problems were they trying to solve by procuring generative AI systems? What problems were they not trying to solve? What problems were they avoiding or leaving for later? We wanted to understand how they were funding this work. Where was the money coming from? And what were they planning to spend the money on? That was pretty interesting. Um, we had some questions about governance, leadership, who was taking the lead in selection and negotiation, and how did that relate to strategies for implementation. Um, we were very interested in the questions around training data and content. One of the things that has always struck me about generative AI systems is that they have this peculiar status of being mixtures of content, computation, and process in the sense of, training and packaging to bring those two together. Um, it seems like, at least where we are right now, the computation is a bit dominant over the content side, and I think, as I'll indicate in a little bit, training data is going to take on bigger dimensions as we go forward. Um, some questions that were very much on everybody's mind about security, privacy, and related matters. And then there are just a number of other kinds of observations that came out of the discussion that we will that I'll also comment on as we go. So that's what we were trying to get at in this roundtable. Um, I want to try and partition the landscape up a little bit before I move into the answers that we were hearing. Um, if you think about where institutions are looking to deploy and apply generative AI systems, there are three big areas. One is teaching and learning, and that is a area that gets very complicated because as soon as you start integrating this stuff into the classroom, you've got some very significant issues around equity and around privacy, particularly if you're relying on sort of consumer grade tools. If you're going to move into that area, want to be positioned, I think, with institutional offerings. The second area is what I would call administrative, but administrative in the absolute broadest kind of sense, not just, your classic sort of administrative transactional things, but a lot of systems and processes dealing with student services, student life, maybe even moving into areas like advising that are, adjacent to teaching and learning as well. There are tremendous opportunities in there that I think many of our institutions are perceiving. A lot of low-hanging fruit there. The third big area is research, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes. The landscape in research is quite complicated and quite intriguing. But I think having laid out those three applications areas, we also need to recognize that a lot of what's been going on at our institutions over the last 18 months, and I think many of our participants were pretty blunt about this, was a reaction rather than sort of a setting a course and following it in this sense when generative AI sort of popped up in the public radar screen and everybody started talking about ChatGPT and it became a, punchline on television and everything else. Um, what you saw was a phenomenon where everybody in the higher ed community, administrators, researchers, students, faculty, all wanted to start experimenting with this to see what could it do? What's it actually good for? Does it work? And so you had this sort of massive distributed practice of experimentation. This was done in such a way as to terrify institutional leadership because you had people throughout the institutional community entering into click-through consumer-based licenses, sometimes spending their own money um, uh, in small amounts to gain experience with this. And basically, messing around with these systems in environments where there was no security guarantees, no privacy guarantees, no no guarantees of any kind, indeed, to the users, and very little or no responsibility for anything on the part of the providers. This, very quickly produced a sort of a panic backlash where you saw federal funding agencies warning grant reviewers and people in similar roles not to put any kind of privileged material into these systems. For example, stating that it would be highly inappropriate to put a grant proposal that they're writing an evaluation of into one of the public chat bots to have it summarize it or do an initial draft of a critique. You saw similar concerns being raised inside institutions about sensitive institutional material dealing with administrative or teaching and learning roles for participants. So a lot of what was driving activity very early on was not just the potential of these three areas of teaching and learning, administrative, writ very large, and research, but also a reaction to this enormous, sort of experimental interest in evaluating and familiarizing people with these tools. Okay, so hopefully that's a little bit of a framework where we can start moving into answering some of these questions. Um, First thing that I should say is when we talk about leadership, in this area, I would say that at least as of right now, it almost entirely rests with the CIO and the IT department. They are the people who are taking lead at just about all the institutions we've talked to in the contract negotiations. Um, in some cases, this is made particularly comfortable because they're building on relationships that they already have for cloud computing capabilities, things like Microsoft Azure or AWS or Google Cloud that fit kind of as natural contract extensions. I'll also talk about co-pilots a little later, which again fit into this kind of contract extension scheme. Um, Having said that, it's important to recognize that behind that leadership, we are seeing a quite wide-ranging collaborative effort among institutional leadership in trying to make decisions, set policy, and particularly as we move from making selections to actual implementation of some of these systems. So that's a fairly clear development. Surprisingly, training sets and licensing of training sets doesn't seem, at least yet, to be as big of an issue as I might have expected it to be. Let's talk about funding, because again, I think we saw a pretty clear pattern in the funding. When we ask who's paying for this, um, it's almost all one-off funding, it seems like. These are special allocations that are coming from someplace high up in the institution, the provost, the president, in some cases, the board of trustees or regents as a very high profile institutional initiative. And we've seen announcements of several of those in recent months. Initiatives in the tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars over a 4 or 5 year period. Now, this is an interesting development because what it says is that this is unstable in the longer term, and that we are going to have to think through funding models and sources of support, which are not in place at this point in a sustainable fashion. Another question, what do they want to spend the money on? Well, we're hearing mostly two things in the near term. One is chatbot access, and the other is access to chatbot-like or large language model-like APIs, typically handled through tokens. These are very different financial models, but those are the two things that seem to be in greatest demand. We are not seeing a lot of demand out of the research side for these things, at least not to the institutional funding. Um, Most of the action seems to be either in the administrative domain or in teaching and learning at this point. Certainly, there is lots of investment going on within the research area on building up communities of interest and communities of practice, assessing things, sharing experiences. But at least right now, it seems to be largely left to researchers and indeed to the grants they're applying to see where the funding is going to go in that area. Now, I do want to flag one exception. There is some significant rethinking going on in HPC, high performance computing strategies and investments at some of these institutions, especially the ones that are making significant high profile investments in generative AI. It is fairly clear that some of these institutions are making assumptions that they are going to need to put high performance computing facilities in place that are capable of training at least good size, maybe not, the absolute top end kind of models that we see in industry, but good sized models. And here I'm talking training, not operational inferencing once the models are trained. That is a very interesting development, which I think will generate some interesting balances and tensions about exactly what the investment profile in high performance computing at some of our institutions really should look like. I want to flag one other area there that we did not explore. Clearly, there is a connection between national high performance computing strategies and the very high-end machines, which are national computational resources on one side, and the institutional strategies on the other. It is not really terribly clear how training capabilities are getting integrated into the national high performance computing strategies. Um, There are certainly investments being made. If you look at some of the very high, large facilities, Labs being a good example, they are doing model training. They are making investments there. But other than some of the discussions that have been happening as part of the National AI Research Resource Pilot, I'm not aware of extended conversations in this area. And I think it's going to be important to listen for those and track how that develops over the next couple of years. So I flag that as an important issue for people who are planning for research computing and high performance computing at an institutional scale and beyond. Let me go back to the sorts of things that people want to be spending funding on. Now, I said the really sort of core omnibus things are access to chatbots and access to the underlying APIs. We are starting to see a generation of additional bolt-on products coming out. These would include things like the copilots that companies like Microsoft are putting out. These include both coding copilots for programmers, but also sort of linguistic or office automation-y co-pilots. There have been typically the pricing model for that is per seat per month. There have been a lot of people running pilots on these. And so far, what I seem to be seeing is quite a bit of skepticism about whether these things are really worth the cost, at least, at least in the current state of the art. I think that's a really good question to be asking. And it's one that actually has a lot of nuance to it. If you think about deploying these within institutions, these add-on services at seat per month rates, who should get them? Do you license them for the whole institution, for individual faculty on request, for certain kinds of administrators? How you make these decisions, what criteria you put in place are really quite troublesome and represent a new set of issues, I think, for many of the institutions who are grappling with this. I would say that generally, institutions are moving pretty slowly and pretty cautiously, doing anything beyond pilots here, at least from what we are hearing. There is a similar wave of products starting to appear in areas around information discovery and analysis that are being marketed to libraries, many of them as add-ons. And we didn't get into that in much detail, but it's again pretty clear that people are taking a cautious view and are asking to what extent are to what extent do we genuinely get the additional incremental value from these add-on tools that are supposed to that are supposed to uh, enhance our experience. Now, particularly in regard to the administrative area and deployment in the administrative area, I do want to make one observation that I found really interesting. Um, you've probably heard the term digital transformation. This is a term that EDUCAUSE has been very fond of, for example, for the last 5 or 6 years. Um, the um, the notion here is applying digital technology to really change the culture and the practices of institutions. And we are seeing in institutions that have set up leadership structures, often independent of or supplementing the CIO, that that deal in digital transformation, that there's a very, very natural kind of alliance between the digital transformation team and a lot of what's going on in the adoption and deployment of these tools, particularly in the administrative area. I do note the comment that Dan just made about Amplify. I will have a word or two about that a little later on, but it is something that came up and is very much right on. Now, let me talk a little bit about training data and how training data fits in here, because I think this is very key. So your typical large language model comes pre-trained on a somewhat opaque, but rather large collection of data that the language model builders have gotten from somewhere. And that seems to be mostly what people want to procure at this point. Once they procure systems, we are seeing many institutions do further training or customization to essentially give these systems local knowledge. What they're doing is feeding in local policies, local websites, a lot of things about local administrative practices and procedures, local events, offerings, individuals, all the sort of thing that you would want to support these kinds of administrative or teaching and learning things at an institutional level, and you'd really only be comfortable doing within the bounds of a system that you've got some good security and privacy controls around. So we are seeing that. That's a very common pattern. We have not seen institutions contract out that training. They're basically saying, we'll take an off-the-shelf model, bring it in, and then run it ourselves. So that is that is a very interesting development. Now, there's a middle ground that nobody really was ready to talk about, and that's disciplinary knowledge. So this is something that is going to make sense, I think, at a higher level than an institution, but certainly is not going to fit well with the very, very general purpose language models that are, the heart of the commercial market right now. We are seeing a number of researchers, a number of publishers, a number of other groups experimenting, especially, but far from exclusively, in biomedical related areas with training models on the literature, building more disciplinary knowledge in. Um, uh, there are examples would be major publishers, groups like the Allen Institute in Seattle. Argonne Labs is doing work in this area again. Um, but we don't have a lot of results on this yet, and much of this is pre-commercial and experimental. I think what happens in this area, and this is a place where I expect both the libraries and the researchers at our institutions to start getting much more heavily involved in the coming year or two, is going to be very critical. But I would flag that as a extremely immature area of the landscape as of right now, and one that is going to be very, very critical to watch. Now, I am mindful of time. I want to just make a few final comments. Um, Around security and privacy, it's really clear that we're going to need a lot of flexibility and a lot of nuance here. Um, we're going to have I think we're going to see an environment where specific units within institutions are going to want to fine tune or do supplemental training on models around specific bodies of knowledge, maybe even at the level of individual labs. And we sort of don't have a way of thinking about this kind of hierarchic or nested levels of knowledge sharing and training. I think developing vocabulary and understanding around these processes is going to be very critical in the next couple of years. The lack of clarity about privacy and security in some of the commercial offerings has really been very problematic and has very much driven a lot of the institutions to start doing local implementations just so they can get some, good degree of control on that. Uh, I do want to note something else. There are quite a few institutions that are running either locally or in commercial clouds um, models for inferencing. They are taking some of the publicly available commercial models and running them for inferencing. Contrary to the general impression that, oh, these chatbots are hugely expensive and only enormous companies can afford to run them. These implementations, in many cases, seem to be quite reasonable. And so one of the messages that we were hearing from a number of institutions was really about the feasibility and the affordability of being able to run inferencing systems based off these large language models, not training them, but running them locally. The affordability of that, assuming that you have the requisite technical expertise to get them up and running. I think that's an important observation that requires some additional validation. But it does sort of open up new pathways. One of the other pieces of advice that that really was consensus and came across very strongly, and as I indicated, we just saw echoed in the chat here, was that institutions are going to want flexibility in terms of running multiple large language models and being able to swap large language models in and out. There are systems that like Amplify or Clarity were two among others that came up that can be used to sort of put a wrapper around these large language models and isolate them to facilitate swapping in and out. Looking at an architecture like that seems to be a really big win if you're going the pathway of local implementation. So I would very much put that on the radar screen as something that you might want to think about. Now, I think I have given you most of the highlights here. There's plenty more to talk about. We will have a bit more in our report, which, as I say, should be out fairly soon. But I want to open this up at this point for comments and questions. I'm going to run about 5 minutes late, as indicated, so we have at least 10 minutes or so for questions, assuming that there are questions or comments. Please pop them either in the Q&A or in the chat. The floor is open. No questions. I'm really surprised. Okay, we got one about how are institutions identifying which AI tools. I think that it's kind of a mix. Some of it is some of it is just being driven by things that come to their attention. Either they're hearing from faculty or students or others about specific tools. Um, I don't know at this point that people feel the marketplace is mature enough that they're saying, I'm looking for a tool to do specifically this, other than the, sort of very general purpose um, chatbot things. I think that this is going to get, as I say, much more interesting in the next 1 to 2 years as we start to see things designed for particular research disciplines proliferating. Um, Question about making good choices about environmental impacts. Um, that did not come up. Um, that's an interesting question, and I will just say it did not come up in our discussions. I know that many institutions are very mindful of the energy impact and the environmental impact of high performance computing broadly, and especially some of this AI-based stuff, and are trying to factor that into their plans about their carbon footprint and environmental impact. Um, but we did not discuss that. There's a question about relevant developing standards. Uh, I don't know that the kind of benchmarks that the research community is using are going to be that helpful to institutions yet. I do think getting a better handle on things like the affordability of locally hosted inferencing is probably important. I would say that one set of documents that we didn't talk about, but I would commend to you, is the stuff out of the Open Standards Institute about what constitutes an open AI model. They have just put out a draft standard in that area, or a draft definition, more accurately, in that area. It's quite controversial, but I think that the discussions around it are worth reading and are provocative because it gets both at the role of training data, the role of code, and the role of the weights. So it really is kind of a helpful thing. Um, let's see. We have one in the questions. Um, AI scrapers, primary resources. We did not discuss the use of well, we did not discuss at all the issues of scraping resources hosted at our institutions in order to train AI models. I think that there is fascinating and important work to be done as we apply some of these technologies to provide better access and navigation to our special collections, for sure. And that is an area that I hope we will have an opportunity to look into downstream. But it doesn't seem like special collections are the hottest target for um, the big um, the big companies like OpenAI who are doing training. Um, Constance has a question about disciplinary training. Um, That's a really we are the asymmetries in disciplinary AI training are going to be very different. Most of what I was thinking in terms of in my comment was around the sciences, the physical, biomedical sciences, materials science, things like that, as opposed to the humanities. The diversity of, potential sources in the humanities, plus the relative paucity of funding compared to the STEM fields, I think makes what's going on there a little bit more speculative and difficult to understand. But that's a really important point and an important qualification that I should have made in my comments. Um, let's see. Question about salary market. Um, so this is the question of probably very few institutions are going to be very successful in maintaining top level AI expertise at the institutional level, other than perhaps in the context of a few researchers and research projects. I think that that's very much the expectation. Nobody that I talk to is really thinking in terms of let's compete with the commercial players for general purpose large language models. I think what they are thinking in terms of is maybe we want to be running those models in environments where we have greater control, and not run them as, software as a service, um, uh, just for the, sort of security and privacy considerations that tag along there. Um, Publication of results and best practices as relates to library resources. I'm not entirely sure I understand that question, Boaz. Can you say a little more? Okay. All right. I'm happy to take one or two more questions before we go. All right. Hearing none, I will then just conclude by thanking all of you for joining us. Um, I hope this was helpful. I really wish I could have said, this is a very tidy landscape. This is the consensus emerging. Here's how it's all going to lay out. This is as confused a landscape as I have seen in a long time. And I hope that you will join with us as we try to get a deeper understanding of it in the coming months. Please do look for our report, and thank you again for joining us today. Take care, all.